The Awakening, from the Fempiror Chronicles, by George Willson. Chapter 6. Transmutation. The sides of the hole were rough, and clearly the passage was not deliberate, but the result of a collapse into whatever had been done below. His head had barely passed below the level of the floor before he made a short drop into a large cave. He looked around quickly, his eyes adjusting to the lack of light. He could just make out the light shade of Beth's dress a short distance from him. He crawled to her. "Are you all right?" he asked breathlessly. He could barely make out her nod, but she seemed to be unhurt. His eyes continued to adjust to the dim lighting, and now he could see that she had gotten the brunt of the collapse. She was dirty from head to toe, her pretty dress caked with the dirt she had broken free during her fall. A look around the cave showed that the hole they had fallen through was indeed not an intended feature of the cave, and the mill was not too far above them. Only the coincidence of the floor giving way just above this passage created the collapse of the ceiling in the tunnel. A pile of dirt directly below the new opening served to show how much of the former ceiling they had loosened in their descents. What remained of the sunlight shone in through the cave's entrance several yards from where they had landed. As close as it was, that would mean that the cave began on the other side of the hill just past the mill. But he had been all over this part of the land, and never knew such a cave existed. "Where are we?" Beth finally said. David looked back to her and held out his hand. She took it and stood up. David gazed deep into the cave and saw that there was light further in. Somebody might be there. Since this cave had not been here his entire life, David was intensely curious as to who might be living here, and why. "Well, we can either go out," he said, pointing to the cave's exit, "or we can check out where that light is coming from." He pointed to the light source deep inside the cave. "I'm not sure I want to check out a strange light," Beth said, and her grip on his arm further solidified this stance. He could understand her fear in this. After all, something might have attacked Ben the previous night, so whoever attacked him might still be in this cave. But there was the matter of this demon nonsense that someone had to dispel. If they could establish that a person was back there, they could bring others out here to deal with it tomorrow. David considered whether they might just leave now and bring others out here tomorrow without checking it out at all. It was certainly the safer alternative, and he did not want Beth hurt. But his curiosity got the better of him, and he thought as long as they were careful, they should not run into any trouble. Besides, this is an open cave. Anyone with any sense could almost expect people to wander in. "It might help us figure out what happened to Ben," David tried to assure her. "People are going crazy over it." He looked at her for any kind of response. She just shrugged and nodded, but maintained her grip on his arm. They walked down the carved tunnel towards the artificial light source within, until they reached a small round room carved out of the dirt. A crude wooden table sat in the center of the room with a lamp on it, providing the light source, though it only barely illuminated the outer edges of the room. Off to the right there was another room, though this one did not appear to have light in it. "It's someone's house," Beth whispered. "Beth, look at that lamp," David whispered. They looked closely at the lamp and found that there was no flame in it. There appeared to be a thin wire in the center of the lamp that was glowing bright enough to light the room. "There's no fire, but it glows," Beth marveled. David glanced around the room again, trying to see into the dark corners. On the ground, next to a far wall, he could see the form of a person apparently sleeping. He tapped Beth on the arm and pointed. "There's someone over there," David said. Immediately, Beth's grip on his arm strengthened, and her pull showed she was not at all interested in finding out who that might be. "David, let's get out of here, please," she whispered desperately. "I just want to know if it's Ben," David said. "Maybe we can stumble across him tomorrow and be heroes." She maintained her grip on his arm as he closed in on the sleeping form. Slowly, he knelt beside the person and looked carefully at the face in the gloom. It was Ben Thurman. "Found you," said David. Ben looked no worse than he ever had. He was a bit more disheveled than usual, probably due to his being so far out of town, but he looked fine. Beth tugged on David's shirt again. He wondered why she was being such a coward about this. "Look at his neck," she said. David looked and saw 2 puncture wounds side by side. If something with unusually long teeth had bitten him, it would probably look like that. It set his mind wandering as to what was really out there. Beth probably had the right idea at this point. "They were right," she whimpered. "He was bitten by something. I'll bet it lives right here. What if it finds us?" David was already backing away from Ben's sleeping form. He was scared, but he did not want to upset Beth any further. "Don't worry," he said. "No one will find—" David stopped mid-sentence. He and Beth had turned around to walk out, and saw a young man standing in front of them. David assumed he had come out of the room that they had passed when they entered. He was in his 20s by David's reckoning, with wild hair and eyes that looked like he had been living in the wilderness for years. His clothes were commonplace, and looked much like what David and everyone else wore, the same shades of off-white and brown. The stranger also held a sword and scabbard at his side, as if protecting it, but unlike someone surprised by strangers in his house, he held a smirk on his face, as if he found this strangely amusing. The color drained from their faces as they looked upon this person whose house they had invaded, and who, despite his smaller build than Ben's, had apparently gotten the better of Ben last night. "I found you," was all the stranger said, before David and Beth screamed and ran as fast as they could out of the cave. Rufus watched with rapt amusement as the young couple ran out of his cave. He knew they had come looking for the one he had taken last night, but also wondered why they were out so late. It was his understanding that the town had declared an after-dark lockdown. He chuckled. Ben rolled over with a drunken lull to him and looked at Rufus. Rufus rolled his eyes. Somehow, this man still had enough alcohol in his system to be hung over, and he wondered if the old man would even be worth taking back to his superiors. "What's going on?" Ben asked, trying to prop himself up. "Oh, shut up, you old fool," Rufus scowled. Ben lay down and rolled back over. Rufus looked back after the couple that had just run away. The sun had gone down, and he was free to go out again. There was a chance he could catch one of them before they disappeared inside for the night. David and Beth ran steadily all the way back into town until they reached Beth's house, a simple white two-story structure shaped like a box with a roof. They stood on the porch, panting, and looked behind them. "Do you think he followed us?" Beth asked. David scanned the town behind them. Beth's house was set back behind a row of houses on the southwest side of town that could look directly into the town square, but from that vantage point nothing had stirred behind them. The door slammed open behind them. The pair screamed and jumped back. They looked up into the face of a large, balding man with a frown on his no-nonsense face and a huge build to back it up. He glared angrily at both of them, and they shrank back accordingly. "Outside at night alone with a young man? Young lady, you'd better have an explanation," the man shouted. Beth's father, Patrick Carpenter, was one of the largest men in town with a legendary temper, and tonight his temper was more than justified. David feared him, which was another reason he had delayed requesting Beth's hand, but tonight he needed to tell what he had seen. "Sir, we found Ben Thurman," he said frantically. "He had marks on his neck." David placed 2 fingers on his neck in the approximate location of Ben's puncture wounds. David looked into Patrick's face and found that Patrick's expression had not changed. In fact, he seemed to be rather unsympathetic to the entire ordeal. "David," Patrick began cynically, "while this discovery is a commendable feat, there is currently a law against being outside at night." Patrick's voice had risen to a shout while he spoke. "But," Beth began, but her father cut her off. David's mind searched for something to say. "Not another word," Patrick continued, his voice continuing to boil over in anger. "This situation is highly improper, and I've half a mind to—" "Sir, I'd like to marry your daughter," David spouted. Maybe that was not the phrase he intended, but Patrick's angry tirade stopped dead in its tracks. Patrick's eyes and mouth opened very wide as his gaze centered on David's face. Beth stared at David, her own expression a mixture of shock and pleasure through the dirt that still rested on her face. David wondered blankly if Patrick would just kill him now and never tell anyone about the incident at all. Patrick's mouth closed and his eyes narrowed. David was frozen. Patrick nodded, and maybe some of that anger had melted away, but David could not be sure. Patrick's moods were a little hard to decipher. "Beth," Patrick said with an eerie calmness, "go inside the house and wash. We'll discuss your part in this in a moment." Beth lowered her head in a nod and complied without another word to either one of them. David watched her go, but then noticed Patrick's glare had returned. David's eyes were locked like a victim to a serpent. Patrick appeared to be gathering his thoughts, and likely they would be much more under control than David's random outburst of desire for his daughter. Not the best sort of thing to say after being out alone with her illegally at night, he thought. "Your declaration changes little," Patrick finally said. "I will be discussing all of this with your father tomorrow, and I would recommend he find out from you before he finds out from me." David nodded. "Yes, sir," he said. He expected that he would do well just to walk in through the front door when he returned instead of crawling back through the window as he usually did. "And if you expect me to allow you to marry my daughter, Mr. Taylor," Patrick began. Oh no, David thought. Here it comes. Had he completely ruined his chances with Beth? Would Patrick use this situation to take all hope of Beth's hand from him forever? "I expect you to follow the rules," Patrick continued. "I will not have a son-in-law who breaks the law." Patrick softened. "Now go home. It sounds like you've already learned how dangerous it can be." "Yes, sir," David said. Patrick closed the door behind him. David stood alone for a moment on the front porch of the Carpenter house. He heaved a sigh of relief. For the moment, it seemed that he might still have a chance with Beth, and her father would undoubtedly bring all this up when he spoke with his father tomorrow. They would be in a heap of trouble for being out late together, and probably just as much for keeping their apparent courtship a secret, since that was bound to come up at some point. But it no longer mattered. It was out in the open. Finally. With a spring in his step, David jumped off the porch and walked across the town square towards his house on the west side of town. He gazed at the stars overhead looking down upon him. He loved the night. Everything was so peaceful and quiet, not like the insanity of the daytime. He breathed in the cool night air. With an exhale, he looked forward again, and then stopped dead in his tracks. The wild young man stood directly in front of him, watching him with that same amused expression he had had earlier. "Who?" David stuttered. "Who are you?" "You are a curious little chap, aren't you?" the man said. "First you invade my home, then I get questions. Who are you?" "David Taylor," David stammered. "Well, David Taylor, I'm Rufus, a special emissary to Hogginstown from the Order of Tapish," Rufus finished with a flourish. David only stared. The Order of what? He felt rooted to the ground. Rufus approached him until he was standing right next to David. He leaned down as if to tell David something very special. "I'm here to reward your curiosity with eternal servitude to the Elrod Malnak of the Order of Tapish, in order to combat the Rostem insurrectionists," Rufus continued. David looked at him, thoroughly confused. He had no idea what anything that Rufus had just told him meant, much less the words he used. He barely had any time to process this when Rufus knocked him to the ground. Rufus pulled something out of a satchel on his belt. Moonlight glinted off its shiny surface. David had never seen anything like it before, and he could not even begin to imagine what it did. Then Rufus stabbed its dual prongs into David's neck, and David realized numbly that this was what created the wounds on Ben. Rufus leaned down close to him. "Welcome to the family," he said. Burning. The fire spread from the puncture wounds in David's neck rapidly through his body. It was as if the very blood in his veins had been set on fire from the inside out. Tears welled up in David's eyes uncontrollably as the sensation spread down his arms and legs, right out to his fingers and toes. He hyperventilated. The burning reached his head, and he convulsed on the ground. Was that laughing? David struggled to open his eyes and look through the tears. Rufus, the maniac who had done this to him, was laughing. He was enjoying what he had done. David's eyes snapped shut as the searing pain traveled into the center of his body. He felt like flames would break free of his skin at any moment. The pain was intense. Was this the end of him? Was his life going to end now on the verge of what was going to be the beginning of his life with Beth? His body would not be able to endure this much longer. He regretted going out tonight. He was sorry he had gone into the cave, and he was going to pay for his sins with his life. He searched for any sound, any cry that could escape his mouth to plead for the help that he knew would not come. This is what had happened to Ben, and this Rufus was the demon that had leaned over him. Ben had experienced this last night, and no one came to help him. It would not matter what David did. No help would come. Everyone would abandon him as they had been. Was old Wit watching now? What would become of him? Ben had not died. Where would Rufus take him? The questions raced through his head in seconds as the flames took hold of his heart. The pain felt like it had suddenly exploded beyond reason and beyond comprehension. David found his voice. He breathed in 2 lungs full of air and more of a gasp as the pain held him firm in its grasp. The last thing David heard was a scream like he had never heard from him or anyone else in his life. It broke free from his lungs and echoed across the night. Tears streamed as he heard it, and still knew that he was lost. Then everything went black. The pain was gone.